Chapter 21. Where do you want us to start? Jack Post stood on the deck in front of Uncle Hugh's apartment door. He looked to be in his mid-60s, salt and pepper at his temples. He was short and slim, but had bunched muscle pushing at the edges of his shirt sleeves, as if he slung things around just for fun, logs or horseshoes. His brother John was taller than Jack and looked even stronger. He could probably throw a whole tree across the road. For men no longer young, they both gave the impression that they could build a house overnight if the job called for it. Since they'd arrived, John hadn't said a word, but his handshake, which came with an ear-to-ear grin, had been surprisingly friendly. Jack, on the other hand, hadn't stopped talking except to ask this question. Adele pressed her hands together. "I'm not sure if you've been in there recently, but it's not good." "Well, your uncle was a man of refined tastes, and by that I mean he liked just about everything. I remember him stopping to pick up soda can tabs like they were fossils, which I guess they kind of are, you know?" It didn't seem like he needed an answer from her. "And books. He couldn't walk past a free book box at the Friends of the Library sale. Seemed like he just needed all the books, that was all. Adopting them like orphans. So, should we go in?" Adele unlocked the door. A blast of sour air hit her nose. "I bought masks for all of us." Jack's eyebrows shot upward. He took one step in, then another one. "You got extras? Because I want to double up on that. How about some Vicks Vapor Rub?" "Not on me, no." "Eucalyptus oil?" Adele shook her head. "Sorry." "Maybe you can go get us some while we start. If you put a little bit under your nose, it makes the going easier. Less stinky, right? I have this theory that it actually helps kill the germs, too, before you inhale them. You can inhale germs, right? I'm not getting that mixed up." "I think it depends if they're airborne or not." Adele hoped like hell that the men she'd hired wouldn't contract some awful disease while helping her clean the place out. She wasn't sure what kind of insurance Uncle Hugh had carried for contractors, another thing for her to find out, but she doubted if it covered much in the way of environmental hazard safety. "Huh, bet you're right." Jack slipped on a pair of blue rubber gloves, the thickest ones Adele could find at the drugstore. He threw another pair at his brother. "This smell here, it don't smell like airborne germs to me. None of them pathogens. This just smells like dirt. And wet paper. Boy, there's a lot of paper in here, huh?" Adele had hoped that her memory of how bad it was had been wrong, that she'd exaggerated it in her head. But in fact, the opposite was true. The kitchen was appalling. If she were Jack or John, she would have backed out and said her thanks, but no thanks. Instead, the Post brothers pushed in farther. "Okay, ship me one of them bags, huh?" Adele gave him an industrial trash bag. He grinned. "This is gonna be fun. I love throwing things out that don't got no more use anymore. Hey, you know what?" He didn't wait for her to answer. "We can tell you stories while we work. Lots of people like it when we do that. Sometimes," he looked sideways at her, "sometimes we get her lunch spot for us if we do that. You know, talking makes work go faster. And we tell good stories." Somehow, Adele knew that by we, Jack meant himself, since John was already silently shoving piles of newspapers off the countertops into a half-full bag. "Pizza, okay?" "Oh, boy, yeah. We like salami and extra olives. Now, what kind of story you want? Real or fake?" That was easy. "Real." "Got it." Jack glanced through a pile of mail that teetered on the edge of what was probably a buried table. No bills, just junk mail. All in the trash?" "Recycling. Here, we'll use this bag for that. Can you tell me about people in town? People my uncle would have known?"
"Heck yeah,"
Jack said. "Let's start with Kathy, the hostess down in Caprese. Have you ever met her? She's the one with the black hair down to her butt and the lazy eye. Really lazy. Basically, her mama always said that her eye went with her personality, but during this one storm, round about 10 years ago, she proved that she was anything but lazy by saving 4 horses and 3 babies, human ones, from the Singing Owl Ranch. Give me an extra bag and go get that uke oil. I'll tell you all about that night when you get back." It took 3 hours, 30 trash bags, and 2 extra-large pizzas for Adele to work up the nerve to ask the question she'd wanted to ask when Jack had started his storytelling. "So, what about Nate?" "Oh." Jack looked upward, his slice of pizza hanging in front of him like it was about to be lifted out of his hands. About Jackie Hamstein, I think I forgot to say. Did I mention that she had 6 toes on one foot? Like, that's the whole point of the swimming hole story, because without that freak show of a foot, she would have never gotten married in the first place, you know? Adele had already lost track of who Jackie was and what had happened at the swimming hole. What about Nate Houston, the bartender? Jack laughed and slid another piece of pizza toward his brother. You say that like I don't know who he is. I know Nate. You're asking for a Nate story. He craned his neck to peer down the stairs as if the man in question might be climbing them to the upper porch where they sat. Because I got some good ones. Jack paused and tilted his head as if listening to something Adele couldn't hear. What do you want to know? Does Nate. Why did this take bravery? Does he date much? You want to know about his girlfriend? Her stomach dropped. Maybe she'd had enough pizza. It's none of my business. Never mind. Jack perched a stack of what looked like religious pamphlets, the kind that get shoved under doors, on the edge of the sink, and propped his elbow on the top ones. Well, now, it's none of our business either, but it sure is fun to watch. See, John and me, we're confirmed bachelors. That's what we say, and I don't mind admitting to you that it's just a thing men say when they can't get the girls no more, or never liked them in the first place. But we liked them, and we sure like to think about the days of old when we could still lock and load. We never married because none of them ever caught us. Maybe that's why we like to watch old Nate. Yep, that could be it. Adele felt as if she were only catching half Jack's words. They were a waterfall. Some were soaking her, and some were just running into the stream. So he's never been married? Nah, not him. Likes to be single. A loner. Something inappropriately hopeful propped itself up in Adele's heart. Really? Yep. Well, if by loner you mean always with a new girl. And I kinda mean that. Constant one-night stands, one after another. Those can just make a guy sad, you know? Ah. Jack bent forward and slapped his knee. Lord, girl, you should see your face right now. I'm just playing. He ain't a creep. He had a girlfriend last year, Christine, something like that. She left, though. Got another job in another town. Ah, she shouldn't ask, but she did anyway. What did she do? Nurse. Some specialty kind. Pediatrics, maybe. Always busy off saving kids. She was too busy for him, really. That was probably the last nail in that there homemade coffin. Pretty little thing, though. Kinda look like you, actually, with that dark hair and blue eyes, but you're bigger at the hips. John looked up from the bag he was filling and cleared his throat with urgency. Jack straightened as if he were about to snap a salute at Adele. Not that you have big hips, 'cause you don't. She was too skinny, that one. That's what we thought, right, John? And not that what we thought mattered, because we always thought he should go for someone local, someone more likely to actually stick around. He looked appraisingly at Adele. What about you? You're gonna stick around? Not that I'm asking about Nate. I wouldn't want to meddle in his life, not even a little bit. No, sir. But you're clearing out this place, like you might want to set yourself down some roots. Mildly, Adele said, roots are good. Well, yeah. Me and John were born at home. Didn't you know that? Just a mile and a half down the road. At home, because our mom was a hippie before they had a word for what she was. Where were you born? Nashville. But you're from here originally. Your family named the town. You can't get much more local than that, I think. And your sister Lana was born in town. Adele had forgotten how much of her family history was held by the locals here. It had always been something that soothed her, and at the same time made her skin itch. Or maybe that was just the dust mites they were surely stirring up by the bucketful. You should date Nate, said John, the first words he'd spoken. A huge cloud of dust flew up from the box Adele was poking through, choking her. Jack said, yeah, he's lonely. I can see that. I got my brother and all, and we watch Netflix at night. If you ain't got romance, family's the next best thing, am I right? Nate, he's got no family no more. Even Hugh's gone. Not that they were family, but they kind of were. And anyway, he's got that look. Adele didn't want to ask which look he meant, scared he might tell her she wore it too. She decided to move to a quieter place. I'm gonna go into the beer can room. Let me know if you need more bags. Jack called out, "Okay, but let me know if you need more stories because I got a funny one about when that nurse of his got stuck on a rock when the tide came in too fast." The story probably involved either Nate saving the pretty little nurse's life or the nurse saving a drowning baby herself on her way in, so no, Adele was just fine not hearing it. Thank God for hard work. Maybe if she kept dragging bag after bag of trash out of the apartment and down the stairs to the dumpster, maybe if she completely exhausted herself, mind and body, she'd manage to stop reliving the feeling of Nate's lips on hers. The heat of them? Maybe she'd forget the way her whole body had reacted, as if it had been plugged into an electrical socket, only hotter. She rolled her sleeves up higher and tied the kerchief more tightly on her head. Then she dove in again. Chapter 22. Nate was growling again. He could hear it, he could feel it, and he couldn't stop doing it. Freaking piece of foreign-made crap. Gah! Dixie wasn't helping by laughing at him. Maybe if you quit swearing at it, Nate would act better for you. You call that swearing? Not your last few sentences, no, but when I got here, the wallpaper was peeling off the walls from your blue streak. It's a coffee machine. It doesn't mind being cussed at. It needs it, in fact. Just buy a new one. Nate sighed and slumped to a bar stool. He rubbed his face with his hands, cursing again when he remembered he'd had jalapeno on them from the burger Dixie had brought him. He stuck his whole head under the bar sink, opening and closing his eyes under the water until the burn stopped making him want to claw them out. Dixie just laughed some more as he wiped his face on a pile of cocktail napkins. I love it when you're grumpy. Sadist. It's just that you're so good at it. He was. Even Nate could admit that. It was maybe one of the things he was best at. It's nice to know I have a specialty. There was a thump and then a dragging noise at the back of the saloon, outside. Dixie jumped. That scares me every time. She looked at her watch. It's almost 7. Isn't that past quitting time? She never stops. Has she let you help yet? Nate narrowed his eyes and pulled off the back of the coffee machine with a yank. It gave a louder crack than it should have, and he suspected he'd just bought himself a new machine, even though he'd been determined to fix it one more time. Ah, the answer is no. Every time I go up there, she says she's fine. Even when the Post brothers aren't there? Especially then. The last time he'd clomped up the stairs, he'd heard her footsteps inside the apartment, light and quick, running for the door. When he reached the porch, he'd been right in time to hear the lock click in the door. Go then. I just said she doesn't want me up there. So? He gave Dixie the look that usually shut up the most belligerent drunk in the saloon. So, I'm not usually the kind of guy who ignores a woman's wishes. Well, yeah, that would make you just an enormo jerkwad. Attractive phrase. It wasn't like he didn't want to help. He did, desperately. Watching Adele heave things up and down the stairs, watching her haul the huge bags to the dumpster, it was killing him. She and the Post brothers had been working for 3 days already. He'd gone from being annoyed at hearing their tramping overhead to it making him almost mental. Adele was working so hard. The stairs to Hugh's apartment went right in front of the side window of the saloon, so he couldn't help looking up every time she passed by it. She'd started every one of the last 3 days, looking fresh, clean. By the end of the day, her ponytail was frizzed and her clothes were filthy. Usually, her face was streaked with grime and sweat. Yesterday, she'd looked on the verge of tears as she hauled up a mop bucket she must have found in the hotel maid's closet. It was killing him not helping. But she didn't want him to. And if she failed, maybe she'd leave. That was the whole point. She needed to leave. It was too bad he was having such a hard time remembering that. My point is that you're not an enormo jerkwad. Try one more time. Enormo jerkwad. Me. Nate pointed at his own chest. You're buying me a new coffee machine if she kicks me in the junk. You got a deal? Dixie flapped a rag at him. Go. There's like 5 people here. I got this. Nate went. Adele was in the middle of dropping huge contractor bags over the railing to the gravel parking lot below. 3 had already hit, and 1 had split open. She threw another one over, and it came so close to hitting him he could hear the air whistling as it fell. Oh my God, be careful down there. Me? You should look where you're throwing that stuff. You want to hit a customer?" Without asking whether or not she wanted him to, he dragged the last bag to the dumpster and heaved it in. The trash company had already been out once to empty it, and they were going to have to come out and do it again. He wondered how much the extra trip was going to cost him. No, he had to remember, it would cost her. "You don't have to do that." He didn't answer, just started shoving the glass floats back into the bag that had started splitting. Of course, it had ripped. Shards of glass were now all over the parking lot. "You had to throw this over the side?" "You try lifting that." Adele leaned over the railing and glared at him. She had 2 dark streaks of grime running up her cheeks, and the sleeve of her green shirt was ripped. She looked exhausted. He didn't think the dark circles under her eyes were dirt. "Drop me another bag to double it, and I will." She dropped it, hurled it, really, down to him. When he was done carefully picking up the shards and sweeping the lot, he went up the stairs. Heavily, so she could hear him coming and bar the door if she needed to. But she didn't. She was sitting at the picnic table, her shoulders rounded with what looked like sheer fatigue. "Hey." "Hey." Nate didn't have a follow-up line. He wished he did. "What can I help you with?" She lifted her head, and the sadness he saw on her face twisted something in his chest. Something he'd forgotten he could feel. "You look like you could use a beer." "Yeah, well, I dug out the refrigerator and cleaned it. I think it took a couple of years off my life, but when I plugged it in, it worked. But that was just a couple of hours ago. Very sadly, there is no beer in it. There was, though." She tugged on her ponytail, tightening it. "Did you know beer expires?" The cans in there had actually caved in on themselves. They were mostly empty, even though they'd never been opened. And they were the cleanest things I found in that fridge. She shuddered, even though the air was warm. "Well, you're in luck then that a bartender came to check on you." "Nope." She shook her head. "I thought about it, but I can't go down there without a good wash, and I want to finish cleaning the shower in here so I can do that, and therefore I'm stuck, sitting here, until I figure out how to solve this problem." Was she almost ready to cry? Something about the shape of her mouth, the tight, miserable way she held it, made him think it was a possibility. "Well, just sit there, then." He turned and started down the stairs. "I'll be right back." "No, you don't have to." But he did. He had to do something to ease that tightness behind her eyes, to make that spot between her shoulder blades drop. In the saloon, Dixie shot him a loaded look. "Ah, yes, I'm a genius. Don't bother denying it." "Don't speak." He put 2 glasses under the boot tap. "Hey, why don't you take the rest of the night off, boss?" "Hey, why don't you mind your own business?" Dixie held up her hands. "I'm just saying, if you don't come back down here by 1:45, I'm closing up." She winked. "And asking no questions." Nate didn't bother to dignify her suggestion with a response. He grabbed a round tray and put 2 bags of mesquite barbecue chips next to the pints. At the last minute, he added a couple of lime-flavored jerky strips. "Classy." Nate shot Dixie a look that should have killed her dead on the spot. She should be a smoking pile of ash. Instead, she just giggled and waved her fingers at him. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do. So basically, don't chew any lead paint. Beyond that, go for it." He took the stairs slowly, keeping his eyes on the level of the pint glasses. Adele was still in the same place. She still looked defeated. That very fact, the simplicity of it, should have thrilled him. And it didn't. Chapter 23. Something inside Nate lit and started crackling like a firecracker landing in dry weeds. "Here, it's not much, but it's the best I could rustle up with short notice." He set down the tray and sat next to her, their backs to the open door of the apartment. In front of them, on the other side of the parking lot below, the enormous old oak tree spread its arms. The ocean's blue curve could just be seen through the leaves. As the fog crept in with nightfall, the blue of the water was getting darker. The air smelled of dust and faintly lighter fluid, as if someone close by was heating up their grill. "Thank you." Her voice was so clenched it sounded like someone had strung her vocal cords too tightly, like a guitar string about to break. They sat together. He didn't try to fill the air with words, just watched the oak tree's limbs sway in the breeze. At first, the space between them felt as tightly strung as her voice had. Then it eased. This high porch had that effect on people. How many times had he ranted about his mother to Hugh up here? He remembered a time he'd been so angry his hands had been shaking. His mother had been sober for almost 3 months, long enough for Nate to get his hopes up again. Then, of course, she'd flamed out in a big way. She'd drunk a fifth of vodka and chased it with some pills she couldn't even name she'd scored off a guy who had been staying in room 3. That guy had gone one step further and accused Donna of trying to rob him after sleeping with him. Nate had sat right there, his hand wrapped around his lighter. He'd flicked it on and let the flame die over and over. That guy basically said my mother's a whore. Hugh had kept his eyes on the bowl of his pipe. Nah, he didn't. I should kill him. Nate had looked at his empty hand, wondering if it were strong enough to hurt the man who threw his mother out of recovery. If you think about it, he's actually saying the opposite. Hugh had puffed lightly, sending the smoke up towards the oak's limbs. He said he slept with her, and then she took money from him. He didn't give it to her. Well, shit, what am I supposed to do? The anger had been so strong, the disappointment so sharp, that Nate wanted to leave, to get in his truck and drive away from Darling Bay, and every single person who needed something from him. Donna needed him to help her stay sober. Hugh needed him to run the bar. The patrons needed him to take care of them. It was his job, yeah, and he was good at it. He liked helping. But his mother falling off the wagon was one too many times. How was he supposed to help her up again? If he left town, he could start over, start new. Start by not taking care of anyone but himself. Hugh had said, what you're supposed to do is just let your mother do what she's gonna do. And love her, if you can. If she'll let you. If she won't, that's not your problem. Hugh had that much faith in Donna, and in him. Now, sitting on the porch next to Adele, Nate said, your uncle was the best friend I ever had. Adele sipped her beer and kept her eyes forward. Why? Well, he didn't want to answer that. He shouldn't have said anything. But she was waiting now. She wasn't looking at him, but he could feel her focus on him as clearly as if she'd touched him. Heat slid up his neck. What do you mean, why? What did Hugh do for you? I guess I haven't put that piece of the puzzle together yet. He spoke into his beer. Just, he believed in me. Oh. Adele looked into her own glass. He was good at that. One of the best. Nate's mother had always thought he wouldn't graduate high school, let alone college. She'd been too drunk to come to either graduation. And he'd never even known who his father was. Donna always got confused when she was asked about that time in her life. What were you doing before you came to Darling Bay? Before a then-stranger named Hugh Darling called to tell him his mother was in the hospital for yet another alcohol overdose? Working, saving. I was out of college, trying to make a go of it. Adele nodded. What did you major in? Social work. Nate missed it sometimes, the simplicity of working the suicide hotline. It had been stressful and sad sometimes, sure. But mostly, people called to talk. He was good at listening, always had been. Way better at listening than talking, that was for damn sure. As long as he was putting cards on the picnic table in front of them, he might as well lay a couple more out. And you always made it clear that if I worked for him long enough and kept saving my money, that he'd sell the place to me. I mean, if you girls didn't come home. Adele remained quiet. She didn't meet his eyes. So Nate went on. I was just a stray, you know, but Hugh took me in. Good old Hugh, the only man who fully accepted Donna as she was, a drunk who never wanted to stop, but who needed a job, a purpose. Being behind the bar gave her an excuse to put off drinking till closer to the end of the night, and that was a small mercy in and of itself. Nate hadn't understood this, not at the beginning. That first call he'd gotten from Hugh, a stranger to him. Your mother's in the hospital. Where? Darling Bay. Where the hell is that? 5 hours north of you, son. He'd gotten there from Fresno in 4 hours flat, driving north on the winding, narrow two-lane highway that led to the ocean, and then north some more, till there were wind-scoured rocks to his left and high stands of redwood and eucalyptus on his right. Darling Bay was barely a bump in the road, a tourist trap, a place to buy ice cream and kites on the family's road trip. His mother had been pale and skinny in the white hospital bed. "You shouldn't be here." They were her first words to him in 3 years. But she'd clutched his hand and held it tighter than he'd ever seen her hold a bottle. In the Darling Bay Hospital hallway, he'd yelled at Hugh Darling. "You gave her a job in a bar. You did notice she's an alcoholic, right?" Hugh had shrugged his bear-like shoulders. "That means she's gonna drink." "Well, right, you own the place. You just keep them around to make money off of, huh? You know she doesn't have money, right? Never has, never will." "I gave her money because she works for me. Does a good job, too." "Give her money to drink." Nate thought he might punch the man right there, just smash him in the middle of the face. "You pay her to keep drinking." Hugh had swatted at his eyebrow as if it itched, as if Nate were an irritating fly. "I pay her because I care about her. She's good people. And if she's gonna be in the bar, and we both know she is, then there should be someone who cares about her close by to get her to the damn hospital when she needs to go." Nate opened his mouth, wanting to swear or yell, but he found he had no words. No one had cared about Donna Houston in a really long time. No one but Nate. Nate hadn't ever been able to help her anyway. "Now," said Hugh, rubbing his back against a door jamb, "you want to get a sandwich? The cafeteria has pastrami, but it's like rubber. I do not recommend it. I swear by their peanut butter and blackberry sandwich, though. Got a place you can stay if you want to hang out in town with her a while." Nate never left. He quit his job at the counseling hotline over the phone and had a moving company box up his apartment for him. He stayed at the Spike until he bought the boat where he lived, until he'd gotten so close to buying the property he could taste it. He'd found a home and a mentor. Hugh had been the only father figure he'd ever had. If only he'd been able to let go of his dream of his songbirds coming home. If only he'd sold to Nate years ago. All this time, Nate could have been using his own money to fix up the place, rather than having to keep his dollars safe in the bank, ready for the purchase that still hadn't come. "Yeah, that sounds like him." Adele looked over her shoulder at the apartment door. "I think that's where he got all that stuff that filled his apartment. Strays, orphans. He never could stand to see someone leave a magazine on a bus stop, you know. He had to take it. He had to read it and make it feel wanted." She paused. "It got worse, though. So much worse. When we didn't come home." Her voice trailed off. Nate opened a bag of the chips, but he didn't feel hungry. "You should let me help you. It'll go faster." She straightened, visibly rallying herself. It was fine. The Post brothers were great. He hadn't been needed. That's what she was saying. "You're not done already, are you?" "Almost totally done. I was going to hire a cleaning crew to come in, but Jack said he and John were as good at cleaning as any maid service, and he was right. I bought the supplies. I did most of the kitchen, but they did the rest."
"You're kidding."
They'd only been working, 3 days total? We even pulled up the carpet in the bedrooms and the parlor. That was how the dumpster got filled yesterday. Her eyes closed as if suppressing a shudder. I've never smelled something like that. It was awful. But the floors underneath are hardwood, and with a couple more moppings and a final polish, they'll be gorgeous. There's a problem in the bathroom with the shower head, but it shouldn't be a big fix."
"Can I see?"
She blinked. Of course. They left their pints behind. She went in first and then spun, spreading out her arms. Isn't it amazing? And God help him. Even as dirty as she was, covered head to toe in grime, as she turned in place, giving him that delighted smile. He wanted to kiss her again so badly that he had to shove his hands into his pockets to keep from reaching for her. He barely looked around at the apartment. All Nate could see was her.
"Amazing,"
he agreed, his voice rough.
"Fucking amazing."
Chapter 24. It was a good answer, and she was happy to hear it, even though Nate didn't even seem to be looking around. I mean, no one could have lived in this place just days ago, right? Nate shook his head as if either agreeing with her or trying to clear it.
Well,
Does it still stink like bleach in here? Because I think I've become immune to the smell of it. I may have burned off the inside lining of my nose. I'm not sure. She knew she was babbling. I guess I shouldn't say that no one could have stayed here. I know Uncle Hugh did, but a sleeping bag in a corner of the parlor doesn't really count. She deliberately ignored the fact that Nate had allowed Hugh to live in a place like that. It was obvious Nate had done his hellfire best. No one had ever been more stubborn than Uncle Hugh. And I'm not ready to trust the mattresses. I have someone coming to pick them up tomorrow. We didn't find many bugs, mercifully, but just thinking about everything that was piled on those beds makes me feel itchy. Beds. She was talking about beds to Nate. Speaking of itchy, I think working with Jack Post has infected me. I'm talking like him. Do you think I'm talking like him? Nate shrugged. A smile slid halfway onto his face.
you haven't thrown in enough non sequiturs. When you start jumping topics from pencil erasers to shrubbery, then you'll sound like him.
Lion tamers on the television?
There you go. Now you've got it.
Seeing Nate's full-on smile, Adele almost felt giddy. It was probably just the half beer doing it. She ignored the heat she felt in her face. Come see the parlor. Always her favorite room in the building, the parlor's clean-out was her proudest achievement of the last few days. When they were kids, she and her sisters had liked to lie on the floor, pressing their ears to hear the music from the saloon below. On busy nights, they'd hear the yips of the dancing cowboys and hear the high, trilling laughter of their dates. When they couldn't see into the saloon, when they could just imagine it, it was full of turn-of-the-century dancers and gamblers. Uncle Hugh had promoted this flight of fancy. He'd come up and tell them tall tales of the gunslingers below, how they'd tied up their horses at the hitching post out back.
No, sugar, it's too dark to go out there. Besides, you wouldn't want to get in a gunslinger's way, would you? They're quick to the trigger, and old Doc Ramsey is out of town birthing another Ingalls baby.
To Adele, who worshipped the Little House on the Prairie books, his words were good as gospel. And when Molly and Lana stood out on the small porch that hung over the street, singing along to Achy Breaky Heart, she would put her fingers in her ears and hum The Streets of Laredo, the only song she thought a cowboy might know. The old spinet piano had been the first thing she'd uncovered. Her mother had loved that thing. Uncle Hugh had known it, and back then he'd kept it polished just for her. When they came into town, he'd have a vase of fresh wildflowers sitting on top. Adele's father had teased him for having a crush on his wife, and Uncle Hugh had always pleaded somewhat guilty. You got the best one. Why would I bother looking for someone when she was already taken? So many memories in this old room. Once she'd gotten the carpet out and all the books were sitting in boxes outside, once the furniture was visible again, Adele could almost hear her sisters laughing in the back bedroom. Soon they would run in, soon her mother would come in singing. Soon her father would thump in doors, pretending to grump when his girls launched themselves at his knees. Earlier, after the Post brothers had left, Adele had been unable to stop herself from crying. She'd lain on the low sofa, which had always been their father's favorite place to nap. The crying jag had left her cheeks sticky and the backs of her legs covered with sofa dust. Her heart just as empty. God, she missed them. All of them. Their mother, gone to cancer, so long now. Adele had been only 16 when she died. Their father, gone to the heart attack. Her sisters, gone to the fight that had followed their father's death, the one that ripped the band apart and sent them to different corners of the world. Sure, she talked to Molly, but she hadn't been in the same room with her for more than 3 years. She hadn't even talked to Lana since the breakup, so long ago now. And Uncle Hugh, the glue that had brought them back to Dad's hometown year after year of their childhood, was dead. Adele was the only darling left in Darling Bay. It didn't feel right. Her eyes still burned from crying, but if Nate said anything about how red they were, she'd blame the bleach and the dust.
This is the way it used to look.
Nate blinked and turned to look behind him.
I'd forgotten all of these.
He leaned forward to the black and white photos hanging on the wall. The biggest one, in a cracked walnut frame, was a picture of Adele's great-grandfather Riley back at the turn of the century. He stood in front of the saloon, a shovel in one hand, as if to symbolize the fact that he dug the very foundation of the building. His clothes were dark, as was his hat and the dirt of the ground at his feet, but the wall of the saloon behind him was bright in the photo, obviously newly whitewashed. His face was proud. Next to him hung a framed photo of the hotel, also brightly white, and the cafe, with its black and white striped awning, clean and new. Nate pointed to the one next to those.
Your great-granddad, right?
Yep, Riley Darling. She'd never known him. She barely remembered his son, her grandfather Charles. He died and left the property to the brothers before she was even 5.
He built the place.
She nodded, feeling pride in the accomplishment of a long-dead man. Strange how family worked. A saloon went up in the gold rush, but it had burned down by the time old Riley got here. The town was almost dead when he built the Golden Spike. Gold was played out, and the miners were a dying breed. But then came the fishing and the logging boom, and it turned out he was in the right place at the right time. Nate nodded and moved to look at another picture.
And here's Hugh and your dad.
I love that one. In an obvious replication of her great-grandfather's pose, they both stood in front of the saloon holding shovels. Their faces were straight like the original photo, but Adele could see the laughter almost ready to burst out of them.
And these, I haven't seen these in years.
Nate paused in front of the first official Darling Songbird band photo. They'd been dressed in vintage Old West women's wear, wide hoop skirts and beribboned hats. Luckily, they hadn't kept that up, being happier in Western shirts and jeans than the vintage dresses their mother had put them in for their first few gigs. The photo was black and white to match the rest of the framed photos, but Adele could almost feel the blue of the sky above them, could almost hear their father's whoop of delighted laughter as the professional photographer, their first, clicked his camera. Yeah, and I should get them digitized, send them to my sisters. She said it like she'd know where to send the mail. She didn't. The tired ache started again behind her eyes. Nate straightened, sticking his thumbs into the front of his jeans pockets. He looked relaxed here, like he fit. Adele realized he'd probably spent more time at the Golden Spike cumulatively than she ever had.
What else needs to be done, besides getting new mattresses?
God, why did it seem like he was asking her a different kind of question? He'd hit her belly as his gaze tangled with hers. What else needed to be done? So much. Why couldn't she think of a damn thing?
You said the bathroom?
Yes, the water runs into the bathtub. I think the shower might be broken somehow. He rocked back on his heels slightly.
You want me to take a look at it?
I'm pretty good with pipes, actually. She was. She'd found out a long time ago that she could learn how to fix almost anything by looking it up on YouTube. He nodded.
Didn't mean to imply you're not. Just offering, in case you want another pair of eyes on it.
His eyes, he meant those changeable eyes. They were Slate right now. Those eyes that were doing things to her spinal column, making it feel all melty, like chocolate left in the sun. Sure, give it a shot. The bathroom was big and egregiously pink. Hugh had painted it when the girls were young, when they'd begged him to. They'd never thought he would do it, but one summer they'd returned to find the room transformed, pink walls and ceilings, a candy-bright shower curtain hanging in the enormous pink clawfoot tub. He'd even made pink curtains by hand, using old cloth dyed with Kool-Aid. They'd loved this bathroom as girls. Adele still did. She looked out the window over the tub. The night sky was streaked with clouds so pink they could have floated in and been at home on the bathroom ceiling.
I can't believe what you did in here.
Nate glanced around.
This is crazy.
Almost a real apartment again. It wasn't as dirty as it looked, honestly. It wasn't hoarder's level bad. We found a dead mouse in a kitchen cupboard, but that was the only diseased critter, and it probably would have happened anyway. She caught sight of herself in the mirror. Okay, I take that back. It was dirty, and it all landed on me, apparently. She was disgusting. How was she even talking to another human being looking like this? And why did that human being have to be someone as naturally hot as Nate? It wasn't fair. He probably woke up hot. She looked like she'd been wearing the same clothes for a week. Nate did all the things she'd done to the pipes, pushing and pulling the same levers.
This is the one I think is broken. Here, take a gander.
She peeked over his shoulder. Yeah, that's what I thought. I was gonna turn the water off and then pull that out. It's loose if you wiggle it, like a tooth. Nate wiggled it, and a wide jet of water shot straight out the hole at them. Adele screamed. Nate jumped backward and then forward again, all the way into the tub, pressing his hands against the now exposed pipe in the wall.
Go turn off the water main.
I don't know where it is. I just said I hadn't tried turning it off yet.
Get in here. Nate jerked his head. Cover the water, and I'll go turn it off.
She clambered over the bubblegum pink cast iron rim. Move over. There wasn't room for both of them to kneel in the tub, and her wet body was pressed against the side of his. She crouched as close as she could get to the faucet.
Here, you have to push hard. It's gonna get us as soon as we make the switch, but okay, go!
Nate was right. The water shot out again, soaking them further. Adele made another sound that was part laugh, part scream. Go, hurry, I got it. He stood and swung his leg out of the tub, putting both of his wide hands on top of her shoulders as he did so.
I'll be fast. Hang on.
For a ridiculous moment, she wanted him to stay just like that, pressing his weight against her. Then he was out of the bathroom, and the coldness of the water soaked through to her skin, and she came back to her senses. Another minute later, the pipe clunked under her hand as the pressure was cut off. She slid backward, still in the tub, and took a deep breath. Footsteps slammed up the stairs.
Did it work? Are you okay?
She could only laugh. Nate entered.
Good. We got it. I didn't know you meant it was that loose. I can help you fix it tomorrow.
Adele laughed harder. She was chilled, the cold water turning the layer of dirt on her skin to mud. Nate's expression did something between a grimace and a grin.
Here, let me help you out.
He took her hands in his and pulled. She stood, and then with his help stepped out of the tub. She dripped onto the hardwood floor. She hiccuped around another laugh, and then her teeth started chattering.
You're freezing.
She wasn't. She was cold, but that wasn't why her teeth were clacking against each other. Adele was a bundle of nerves all of a sudden, her arms and legs shaking. It was a combination of exhaustion mixed with the tension of being so close to the man in front of her. He didn't let go of her hands.
We need to get you out of these clothes.
His voice. That's what did it. Not the darkening of his eyes, the way his face looked over hers. Not the way he held her hands tightly, like he'd catch her if she fell. It was his voice, that roughened, weather-beaten voice. We need to get you out of these clothes. And Adele made a decision that was instant and probably very, very wrong in the long term. But this minute, the one that stretched out taut in front of her, was the short term. That was all. Embracing the moment. Molly would applaud her. Will you help me? She asked. Chapter 25.
Nate just assumed he'd misunderstood her. With the pipes? Yeah, of course.
A blush lit her cheeks, and she closed her eyes for a brief second. Then she opened them, and she looked at him. She gazed into him. Her voice was soft, almost worried. I meant with my clothes. She stared down at herself. Oh, ever-loving Patsy Cline, what am I doing? She pulled back her hands and rubbed at a particularly large patch of wet dirt right over the soft swell of her belly.
Adele.
I'm disgusting. She was anything but. Even covered in dirt, she was gorgeous. Her wet green shirt clung to her breasts, showing tightly butted nipples under her thin bra. Her hair was a wild, dripping tangle. There wasn't a more beautiful sight in the state. He would wager every cent of his savings on that. Then she gave that laugh again, the one that made him feel like he was drinking champagne, fizzed happy bubbles. I need a shower. He looked at the tub with confusion.
Well, that's not going to be easy.
My room has water. She said the words fast and then covered her face with her hands.
Oh.
His IQ had just lowered into single digits. She parted her fingers, peeking at his reaction. Racy? Then she darted around him, running for the door. It was a dare. And damn, he'd always loved a dare. Her feet were light on the porch, pattering down the staircase. It was fully dark now, only a dull red glow from the setting sun at the water's edge. and the only lights were the white ones twinkling upward from the arbor below. More strands of the lights lit their way through the rose walkway to the hotel, but Nate would bet both of them could run this path wearing blindfolds. He'd never run it with his heart pounding this hard, though. This was a bad idea. This had to be a bad idea. He couldn't sleep with Adele Darling. He needed to get her out of town. This was the wrong way to do it, not to mention the fact that she was grieving. It would be taking advantage of her, pretty much the opposite of what he usually aimed to do for a woman. Still, he chased her laughter through the dark. By the time he reached the door that had been his for years, she was inside. The door to the bathroom stood open. Her laughter had stopped abruptly. He took 3 more wide steps forward. She would be changing her mind, of course. What the hell were they doing? "It's okay," he started to say. "We can just..." But then he could see her. Adele stood in the middle of the small bathroom, the side of her face lit only by the moonlight coming through the open window. Her fingers rested lightly on the waistband of her jeans. Her voice was serious. "Is this a bad idea?" Nate shook his head once. "No." Then he nodded. "Definitely." That same small sideways smile crept across her face. She kicked off her shoes, sending them flying past him, one at a time. "I agree." She undid the button on the fly of her jeans. "So, I'm just gonna get in that shower. You can either leave, watch, or join. Your pick." Well, there was only one answer to that. Nate shucked his boots and stepped forward. The bathroom had been small enough when he'd been the only one taking showers in it. "You know I'm an environmentalist, right?" He pulled off his shirt and then tugged the bottom of hers upward. She gasped as the cold, wet fabric moved against her skin. "You are?" "Sure, I'm a very concerned citizen." Nate pulled the shirt over her head. The bra that he'd been able to make out through the cloth turned out to be cream-colored lace, a shade lighter than her skin. He shivered, and it wasn't because of the cold. "El Nino aside, there is a severe drought in California. Every drop counts." "Oh." She reached behind her back to unclasp the bra. "Yeah, you're right."
"Conservation is key."
"Conversation, yes. I mean, conservation. Key." She dropped the bra, and Nate felt his brain stutter and then stall. Her breasts were full and round, larger than they looked in her clothes. Her nipples were dark and tight. She had goosebumps all over her skin, and he saw the same shiver he'd just felt rock through her. He put an arm around her, pulling her hard against him. She expected him to kiss her. He could tell by the way she angled her head, but instead, he moved his mouth down, bending her back so that his arm was supporting her, so that his mouth was right over that perfect left breast. He breathed out all of the warmth in his lungs he gave to her nipple. He did it again, 3 times. Above him, tilted backward, her own breathing quickened. Then he took another breath and did the same to the other one. He didn't lick. He didn't touch. He held her, and he warmed her. Adele gave a little moan and gripped his head with her hands. "Please, shower. Not clean." It was funny. She wasn't clean, that was true. Her skin smelled like soap, and her hair smelled like sweet alyssum, but she also smelled like hard work, sweat, metal, and grime. She smelled like a woman who could roll up her sleeves and work hard as hell to do something difficult, and he'd never smelled anything as sexy before. But she was cold. Nate straightened slowly, bringing her up with him. He kept his mouth an inch from hers and reached around her to turn on the shower. Her breathing was shallow. So was his. He could almost taste her. And it made him move even slower. He wanted to prolong the moment, wanted to keep from kissing her as long as he could. It felt like a test. A test he wasn't going to mind failing. The shower water heated. Their breaths still commingled. He slid his hands down between them and finished undoing her fly. Then he undid his own. Still very carefully not kissing her, he pushed down her jeans, then his, their underwear next. He was so hard he was almost scared to touch her. He was so ready that if she'd wrapped a leg around him, he would lose his damn mind and maybe several other things, and what kind of a jerk-off would that make him? No, this woman deserved a really good warm-up. Literally. Her teeth were chattering again. Stepping around her, Nate adjusted the faucet so the water was piping hot. Then, holding both her hands, he backed through the water until he was against the cold tile on the other side, and she was right under the shower head. Adele stood in the rush of the water, her eyes closed, her mouth open. Her hair was dark and long, slicked to her breast. Completely unable to help himself, he reached forward to touch a nipple, slicking the water from it. He would control himself. His body was ravenous, desperate for her, but he could hold himself back. They could go at her pace. Adele's eyes opened. Then she leaned forward, and her water-sleek lips kissed his hard, and Nate lost the second-to-last shred of control he had. Chapter 26. Adele couldn't decide which was hotter, the feeling of his mouth against hers or the heat of his cock against her stomach, hard as rock and slippery with the soap on her skin. While his mouth ravaged hers, his tongue against hers, his teeth tugging at her lips, his hands ran the bar of lavender soap over her skin. It was an excuse, that's all the soap was. She was past the point of caring whether or not she was clean. But when he turned her around, keeping his mouth on her neck so that he could soap her back and her ass, and then all the way down her legs and back up, when he teased her with the soap, getting a finger's width away from the V between her legs, she threw her head so far back she inhaled a mouthful of water. And that made her laugh. Her laughing made him laugh, and the sound of him, that rumbling, low quaking that poured into her via the kiss that she didn't ever want to break, was like nothing she'd ever heard. If she could put that sound into a love song, it would be the last love song anyone ever had to write. He felt perfect, and it scared her. His arms fit around her, and he knew how to kiss her so thoroughly she forgot which way was up. If the shower hadn't been pounding down on her, she would have floated up right to the ceiling. But the shower wasn't the pounding she needed. "You missed a spot?" she whispered in his ear. Mm-hmm. It was both an acknowledgement and a threat. He slid the soap down between her breasts and then rubbed it between his hands. He put the soap on the ledge of the tub and then slicked his hands against the swollen part of her. Quickly and efficiently, devastatingly, he washed her. She was shaking by the time he said, "Now you're all nice and clean." I don't want to be nice or clean. But she couldn't say it. Just the very act of telling him he could join or watch her in the shower had freaked her out enough for one day. Adele was normally brave enough in matters of sex, but this felt bigger somehow. Well, damn it, he felt bigger anyway. She wrapped her hand around his cock softly, sliding her fingers down to its base. Nate put his head back against the tiles and groaned. "I have a better idea." She trailed kisses down his chest, the water beating against her shoulders and back. She took the tip of his shaft into her mouth. His hands rested lightly on the top of her head, and this time his groan sounded almost pained. She placed the flat of her hands against the backs of his thighs and tasted him with long, slow strokes of her tongue. He pulsed in her mouth and pressed his hips forward. She took him as deeply as she could, then backed off, and then took him deep again. "Adele," Nate warned, his voice tight. "You have to stop." She took his cock out of her mouth, her hand still wrapped around the shaft, and peered up at him, blinking rapidly through the water. "Or what?" Oh, God. Nate hit the shower handle. "Out. Where's your towel?" He sounded so panicked Adele laughed, a bubble of joy at the top of her lungs. "Right there in the rack. But now I'm curious as to where you keep them." Nate grabbed the towel so fast the rack rattled. He dragged it harshly and haphazardly across her body, then his. "You're not really very good at this whole drying thing," she teased. She saw his jaw clench. Knowing she was the cause of his tension was a delicious, heady feeling. "Oh, yeah?" Nate kissed her then hard. She leaned into him, pushing her hips against his. They gasped against each other.
I'd better show you what I'm good at, huh?
Big words.
From a big man.
His voice was teasingly echoing her tone, but there was nothing wrong about his statement. His cock, like his shoulders and thighs and jawline, was wide and long. It was so hot it almost burned her touch. Bed. In her bed now. God, no, it was his bed. The thought was a confused jumble in her mind, and she didn't care. She needed him in her, as strong a need as she'd ever had in her life. Protection, she muttered, diving for her purse and digging through it. Surely she had an old condom in the pocket where she kept her headphones and spare pencils.
I have one here,
he said, popping open the Martin's case. Jackpot. From under a capo and a tuner, he pulled a small cardboard box. Guitar players, Adele said, and she laughed again. That was surprising her the most. Usually when she had sex with someone for the first time, she was nervous. She wanted to get things right. And with Nate, God knew she didn't want to get things wrong. But she wasn't worried. This was just plain fun. Maybe it was because she was exhausted. Maybe it was because she'd spent the last 3 days doing nothing but hard, back-breaking work and she needed something pleasurable. Maybe it was because Nate's doubled cheek was the sexiest thing she'd ever seen. But being with him was just fun, plain and simple. She took the condom from him and unwrapped it. She went to her knees again, this time on carpet, and rolled it onto him, carefully, slowly. His left hand had a slight tremor now, as she noticed, and it felt like she'd won a prize at the fair. She grinned up at him. There, now, you were gonna show me something? With a noise that was more roar than any word she could identify, Nate came at her as if she'd unleashed him. He lifted her off the ground, his mouth claiming hers. He dropped her on her back on the bed and then moved to put himself between her legs. Adele lifted her hips, but he shook his head and moved himself away.
My speed now,
he said. She whimpered as he moved down her body, grazing her skin with his teeth, with his tongue. When he reached her center, he unfolded her with his fingers, blowing gently, following the air kiss with a real one. She gave a sharp cry as he slid a single finger inside her and let his tongue lap her clit. Please, she said, but she wasn't sure what she was asking for or if he could give it to her. He didn't stop and he didn't slow. If anything, his tongue picked up speed and he pressed another finger into her wetness. Adele's teeth started chattering again, lightly. Her whole body shook. He raised her higher and higher, and then, right when she was on the very edge of coming, he slid yet another finger inside her and curled his hand, keeping his tongue striking, beating against her. She came so hard and so fast it felt like something broke inside her, crashing to the ground. Unexpected tears came to her eyes. Oh, she said when she could breathe again. Oh. Nate slid up her body, keeping his hand in contact with her, skimming her hips, her stomach, her breasts, her neck. He stayed on his side, his fingers touching her jaw gently, then her nose.
Are you okay? Shit, are you crying?
Adele, I'm fine, she said. She was so fine. But she was in no way done. Adele kissed him. She could taste herself on his lips, and the mixture of salt and sweet went right to her head. He tried to say something, but the twisted noise only came halfway out of his mouth. Then, because she couldn't help herself and wouldn't have been able to even if she'd wanted to, she swung her leg over his body. She planted the flats of both her hands on his chest. Are you? She didn't know how he planned to end the sentence. Are you sure? Are you ready? It didn't matter. She wanted him. He wanted her. And instead of being tangled up in her own thoughts, she could only think of one thing, and it was him. Just him. She kissed him again. Yes. It was a whisper against his mouth. He blinked once, slowly. Then he lifted his hips against her as she pushed down. Her slickness took the entirety of his length into her body in one hard thrust. She stilled, full, so full. Wait, she gasped. Just give me a minute. 1 minute to adjust to this feeling of... What was it? He was so big that he stretched her, but that wasn't what she needed a second to process. Adele needed to push back the tears that were starting again. It felt like coming home. And she hadn't done that in a really long time. Nate raised a hand to her cheek, cupping it. She could tell by the way the muscles in his neck recorded that he wasn't breathing any better than she was. We can stop. We can do whatever you want. She felt his thumb brush the top of her cheekbone. Do you want to stop? That was the last thing she wanted. She shook her head hard. One teardrop fell to his chest, a tear she barely understood. This. She moved against him. This. Nate's eyes stayed on hers. She moved slowly at first, and honestly, it would have been fine if his gaze had drifted lower to her breasts, to what her body was doing, where their bodies were meeting with such heat and wetness and intensity. But his eyes stayed fixed to hers, and nothing had ever made her feel as sexy. Ever. Faster, then. She sat all the way up, and his hands gripped her hips, lifting her, drawing her back down. The heat rose, red flames flashing up through her till she thought the top of her head might catch fire. Faster, more, harder. It was pumping into her now as much as she was riding him. She lost her balance, dizzy with lust, with heat, and fell forward onto his chest. Instead of repositioning her back up on him, Nate locked her mouth into a kiss, plundering her mouth with his tongue as they moved. He wrapped his arm around her low back and rolled, staying inside her. Oh, God. He filled her so much she could barely breathe. Please. Even faster now. She locked her legs around his back and barely had to move to meet his thrusts. And still his eyes were on hers, as if he was inside her mind as much as he was inside her body. As if it was more than just simple sex. It was as if he was making love to her. And with that, Adele's second climax rose inside her. With every one of his strokes, his pubic bone hit her clit. She writhed harder, the flame rising so high in her chest that she forgot to breathe at all, which was fine since there was no need for oxygen, not for something as perfect as this. They needed nothing but each other, but this. She needed only him. She came with a low scream, her head tilting back, finally breaking eye contact with him. His pace slowed as if he was holding himself back, waiting. Waves of pleasure rocked through her, and she kept her hips in tight contact with his. Unable to help herself, she gave a laugh of sheer delight. She lifted her head and opened her eyes again. His eyes were still locked on her face, and as she watched, as she fell into his gaze, he speeded his thrusts, and then, with one sharp shout, he came. She felt his cock jerk inside her, and a deep, river-wide satisfaction filled her. He blinked hard, his mouth still wet from hers, but never looked away from her. Adele had never felt so seen. Oh, Kitty Wells. He laughed, collapsing against her, rolling sideways. His arms wrapped around her, drawing her close. Well, yeah, he finally said, the laughter still thick in his throat. Kitty something, for damn sure. Joy rose in Adele's sternum, surprising her with how light it felt in contrast to her limbs, which were heavy as river rocks. After sex, Adele was usually the kind of person who bounded out of bed. Normally, she would offer her partner a snack or some water. She'd shower, cut up strawberries, or even do the dishes. In the past, sex had started something up inside her that the actual climax wouldn't finish. She would usually at least start a conversation. Pillow talk with a purpose. You were either getting to know someone more or you were cementing a relationship. But here, in his arms, she just felt finished. And safe. Adele let her heavy lids close. She was conscious, though barely, that Nate's arms were going to catch her as she fell into sleep. So, she fell. Chapter 27. Adele was the perfect weight in his arms. It was enough to perturb a man. Nate had never felt anything like it before, the way the shape of her body fit his. It was normal for two people not to be comfortable while lying naked in bed together for the first time. Bodies were weird things, and that was fine. That made life interesting. But Adele fit him. He didn't have to shift because the weight of her head made his arm fall asleep. His legs didn't get cramped. No Charlie horse attacked his calf muscle. When she blew out a puff of breath in her sleep and rolled to her side, he followed, wrapping his body against hers. He'd never even understood the term spooning before. He usually thought of resting in bed with someone as more like a couple of forks tossed haphazardly in a drawer. But Adele just fit there, too. A perfect smaller spoon to his bigger one. Nate tightened his arm around her waist. The scent of night jasmine snuck in through the dark, parted curtains. Adele snuggled back against him with a sigh. He'd learned in the last hour, as she slept against him, that she made the most adorable little sleep noises. She was like a kitten, except she had curves for days and skin like silk. Kitty Wells, he snorted softly. Adele murmured something that he couldn't quite hear. What was that, darling? He realized he'd just called her by her last name and was immediately glad she wasn't awake to be annoyed with him for it. That must happen to her with every man she dated. And that small thought of the other men in her life lit something in him like a cold flame. He didn't want to think about her with another man. Not that he was jealous. He'd never been jealous in his life, not once. But hell, if this was what it felt like, no wonder everyone wrote songs about it. It felt like a sickness deep in his guts. Not pleasant. He shook off the thought. Home, Adele whispered. She turned in his arms so that she was curled on her side, now facing him. Nate put a hand on the side of her head, brushing the lock of hair out of her face. What about it? Her eyelids fluttered and then opened slowly. She didn't jump exactly, but she did have a moment of looking very surprised. And then very pleased. A smile spread across her face. Hi. Hi. He brushed her eyebrow with his thumb. What about home? What? How long was I asleep? I think we've been dozing an hour or two. You said home. I did? She blinked, and even though she didn't move a muscle, he would have felt it if she had. She got further away from him. He realized he didn't know exactly what she counted as home. Darling Bay, Nashville. Where's home for you? She pulled her hands up into a ball in front of her, as if she were praying. She was still lying on her side facing him, still shin to shin, forehead to forehead. He held her top hand loosely. Where's your home? She countered. Here. This very property. But where did you come from? A little inland farming town on the edge of Fresno. Known for nothing but its football team, circa 1996, and the amount of meth produced per capita. It was a good place to leave. When did Darling Bay start to be home for you? Nate still wanted to know why she'd said the word in her sleep, but he'd let her sidle around the edge of the answer if she wanted to. When I got here, well, it wasn't instant. Of course. I expect it took at least a day or two for it to sink in. How did you know? Nate moved his hand to her side, where her waist curved in. Her skin was warm, almost hot to the touch. If he had to leave his hand in one place for the rest of his life, he would choose to leave it right here, with her face only inches from his, her breath mixed with his. Honestly, when I met you. What did he say to make you feel like that? It was the way he took care of Donna, the bartender. I saw the way he looked at her, even when she was falling down drunk. You could tell a block away he was a good man, a man who took care of other people. Then he tried to take care of me, too. Adele smiled. He would. Did you let him? He paused. Of course I did. Because you never saw it coming. Nate remembered the way Hugh had suckered him into helping him on the property. Just a few minutes of raking in the back. Do you mind helping an old man with a back to match? The way he'd made Nate feel like he'd done the best raking job anyone had ever done before. Nate had reacted like a 5-year-old being praised for picking up his toys instead of the 24-year-old he was. Hugh had made him feel like a son, immediately. And Nate had never been a son to anyone, not to his dad, whom he'd never known. Not really even to his own mother. He'd had to take care of her for so long. That didn't leave time to look up to anyone. You're right.
Did he call you kiddo? Surprised, Nate pulled back. Yeah. Yep. The way he said that, huh? Nate nodded. Shortly after helping Hugh rake, still deciding if he should stick around this small town where his mother was being so well taken care of, Nate had changed the oil on Hugh's old Bonneville. And Hugh had just jerked his head in a nod and said, "Thanks, kiddo." That had been the moment Nate had decided he wanted to stay forever in this town where an old guy was willing not only to give his mom a shot, but to give him one too. It made me feel like I was really someone. Yeah, he could do that to a person. Adele stopped and covered her lower lip with her fingers. It felt like she needed a minute, maybe to herself. Nate closed his eyes and just lay there with her, his hand still on the swell of her hip. Finally, after he'd counted 3 cars out on the road, and they didn't come by that often after dark, she spoke. "You'd think home for me would be Nashville. That's where we grew up, after all. My mom's grandmother lived on the edge of town, and we all lived with her off and on when the money was bad. But we always moved so much, anywhere Daddy could get a job doing sound, anywhere Mama could get a gig. We'd move towns even if the gig was only for a month. Chattanooga, Gatlinburg, Franklin, Pigeon Forge." She was a singer. Nate thought he'd heard that in Darling Bay gossip, something that was always in fashion in the saloon when one of the girls' albums was playing on the jukebox. The very first Darling Songbird, the one who didn't make it. She was the one with all the dreams, but then I came along and ruined them. I'm sure you didn't do that. Adele ignored him. She was the reason we formed into our little band. Even when we were so young we practically didn't know how to read music, she wanted her songbirds to sing to her. We came here to Darling Bay every summer and every Christmas because Daddy wanted to be with his brother, and Mama didn't have any family left in Nashville after her mom died. Uncle Hugh was as bad as she was, putting us on the little stage in the saloon. I remember that at our first show, we had to stand Lana up on an apple box just so she could reach the microphone. When Mama died, Adele's voice went husky, but her eyes stayed clear and stayed on his. He stroked her shoulder gently. When she died, that's when we got serious about the band. We owed it to her. Her voice dropped, especially me. Adele. We tried to make her happy in life, and it hadn't worked, so we tried after she died. She cleared her throat. Then we got known a little bit, and we just started moving around more. I guess I just never felt like I had any kind of home. I love Nashville, and it's been good to me, but it never... Wait, how did we get on this topic again? She reached her head forward to kiss him, and the sweetness of her lips, the quick, light heat of them, made Nate want to forget what they were talking about. He stirred again, just thinking about how she had felt underneath him and on top of him. Damn. Okay, there would hopefully be time for that. He pulled back. But why did you say home? It was a dream. A quick 5-second one. I barely remember it. What was it? I was lost. Her hands balled into fists. Where? I don't know. A city I didn't know. I knew that if I could find the right street, I'd find my way home, but every time I was getting close to it, it changed, and I was going the wrong way again. He rubbed his thumb along the strong tendons in the back of her wrist. What did home look like? Adele's eyes widened, and she rolled onto her back, away from him. Her voice, when she spoke, was surprised. Not this. Adele waved her fingers in the air. Did she mean the fact that they were stark raving naked in his bed? Because he hadn't expected that either, least of all the way she fit in his arms. She went on. Darling Bay. I guess it's always been the only home I've ever known. Oh my God. That's it. That's what I was trying to find. I can see it now. The street I was trying to find led to Route 119. And then here. Route 119 was a small back road that locals took to get to the main highway. It was the fastest way to Darling Bay. Locals routinely pulled the signs down to discourage extra looky-loos on the Pacific Coast Highway.
There were plenty of Darlingites who thought their town was better off unfound than unspoiled. Nate rolled onto his back, too, and followed her gaze. He should be worried about the fine crack that ran from the wall to the old wooden ceiling fan, but at this point, a crack was the least of his worries when it came to fixing up the place. Yeah, I never had a dream about trying to find the road into Fresno, that's for sure. I was trying to get home. Oh my God. A chill hit Nate's skin, as if the fog had just settled low outside and was now pushing under the door and through the darkened window screen. Something was happening, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something that wasn't good. What? This is home. The chill intensified. So you've been saying. But I bet a lot of people could have told you that, darling girl. It was a title now, not an endearment. That's not news. Adele spun upward, pulling the sheet with her. Nate, this is our home. We can't sell you our home. Excuse me? What he wanted to say was much less polite. It seemed so obvious now that she'd had the thought in full. Darling Bay. Oh my God. You know what Uncle Hugh said every time he talked to us on the phone, and in every card he ever sent us? Fly home. That's what he always told us to do, to fly home. And none of us ever thought a thing about it. Nate sat straight up. He would have been less surprised if she'd sprouted wings from her shoulder blades. You want to run that by me one more time? We can't sell. I'm so sorry. This is as surprising to me as it is to you. He found himself on his feet, naked, unsure how he got to standing, but determined to stay upright. Nate, Adele reached one hand out to him, but he was already yanking up his jeans, jerking on his boots. He pulled his t-shirt over his head, not caring it was on backward. Where the hell is my ball cap? He shoved his hands through his hair, which he knew was sticking up wildly from what her fingertips had done earlier. I'll help you. You don't have to. It's fine. His scowl felt a mile deep, his voice a growl. I'll get it from you tomorrow. Nate, don't go. We should talk about this. What's there to talk about? You're taking ownership of the Golden Spike. We'll keep you on. He froze, his arms still at his sides, his breathing made heavy. Mighty good of you, ma'am. Don't do this. Am I supposed to be happy for you? I can't do this without you. The dead middle of his chest felt frozen, as if his heart had been dipped in deep well water. Please stay, she said. I'd love your help. And that was maybe the worst thing she could have said to him, because she wasn't talking about needing his help as a man anymore. She wasn't talking about needing him in bed. She meant she needed his help with the hotel. The sex had probably just been a bonus. I know I'm nothing more than the hired help. I've been that my whole life, and I'm used to it. He finally located his ball cap under the side chair and pulled it on, brim forward. He shaded his eyes as if she were the sun. But I'll be damned if I play the cabana boy role, too. He slammed the door so hard the shutter on the window next to it fell off the window and hit the porch with a clatter. And if he could have slammed the door twice, 20 times, till this whole side of the hotel fell down, he would have. Chapter 28. Adele slept hard, her dreams bleak, shot with glimmers of silver. One of her dreams was about a dress she'd had years and years ago, one of her favorite onstage dresses. It looked matte black when she was still, but shined pewter when she shimmied. She'd lost it somewhere along the way, ripped it irrevocably, probably. The stage was hard on clothing. When she woke, she felt a warmth ripple through her, a happiness that shone the same silver, brightening the room. She remembered Nate's skin against hers, his mouth so hot, so giving, so demanding. The warmth of the memory was yellow and bright, the same color as the sunshine leaking through the curtain. Then, home. Darling Bay was home. For the first time in 11 years, for the first time, she wanted to stay somewhere for more than just a few weeks. And it wasn't about work. It wasn't by default Nashville. Nate's thunderous face as he slammed the door. The brightness drained away as she remembered his fury. But she hadn't done anything wrong. She wanted to take over the Golden Spike, to fix it, to make it run, make it work. She knew she could do it. She was good at running a small business. She was her own business, and she'd been working without a manager, without anyone else for years. She could do this. She'd start with a saloon. It would take time to revamp it into something that would pull in both the locals and the out-of-towners, but she was creative, and it was what her uncle would have wanted, not to mention her father. Dead men running her life, but they were dead men she'd loved with all her heart. She would honor her heritage and make them proud. And maybe if she did it just right, maybe it would bring her sisters home. Hugh's plan, all along. She was playing right into it. If only she'd done it earlier. It would take some time to talk them into it, but surely she could. She'd have a real home to lure them with. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine sitting on one of the picnic benches in the back courtyard, side by side, heads back, looking up at the stars. Molly, soft and warm, on her right, Lana, thin and impatient, on her left. With her sisters, the most important women in the whole world, the ones who completed her, Adele could do anything. She could perform open-heart surgery if Lana held the scalpels for her. She could build a spaceship if Molly told her jokes while she did it. Together, they were more than 3 people. They were Mama's songbirds. Adele pulled the sheet up to her chin and thought hard. This could really work. Molly could come and run the cafe. She was a nutritionist. That wasn't so far away from meal planning, was it? It was a similar thing on a different scale. Molly would be so good at it. She was a wonderful cook and even better with people. Adele could imagine it now, Molly greeting customers with menus and a huge smile and seating them with a laugh. Barbecued oysters and grass-fed burgers would be brought to beach-tired tourists, like the old days. And Lana, she was so good with, well, okay, she wasn't that good with people, but she'd done that stint on the stage crew, insisting it was more fun to build their sets than it was to write songs. A whole 6 months, Lana had been either under the stage, building it for the night, or on top of it, singing her heart out to sold-out crowds. Of all 3 sisters, Lana was the best at construction. She could tear apart and rebuild the hotel, couldn't she? Adele stretched across the bed, feeling her body ache in places it hadn't for a long time. She rolled, her cheeks hot as she remembered the night before, and pressed her face into the pillow. It was the wrong thing to do. She could smell him there. Involuntarily, her fingers clutched the pillowcase. Nate. In reaching for her dream, it was new, but it was her dream. It felt so familiar to her that maybe she'd always had it and just hadn't known it. She'd be taking Nate's away, completely. But that wasn't fair of him, was it? He'd wanted to buy the place, but he'd also known Hugh had hoped the girls would come home. Surely there were other rundown saloons on the coast for sale? No, there weren't. She knew there weren't. Something else, then? Or she could talk him into staying on as bartender. And then what? Would she continue sleeping with the hired help? Was that fair? Would he leave for good? And why did her body feel so empty and cold at the thought? Adele rose, her legs shaky below her. She showered, trying to force out the images of the night before. The towel he'd used on both their bodies was still lightly damp. She took 2 aspirin for her head. A new chapter. She could hear her mother's voice in her head. Nothing like a new chapter for stirring up the heart. Mama had loved a new chapter, whether she'd been reading them Little Women or moving to yet another town where she might hit it big. There were lists to be made, shopping to be done, old wood to be ripped out, those awful built-in seats that ran under the front windows of the saloon, and new carpentry to be put in, paint, a new drinks menu, entertainment to be hired. And Adele wasn't quite done with Uncle Hugh's apartment. She'd get the mattresses today, and she could be moved out of Nate's room by tonight. It was exciting. She should feel nothing but eagerness, enthusiasm. Instead, she thought of Nate's mouth against her body, the way his lips and tongue had toppled her, the way his weight had crushed her so sweetly. Don't think about Nate. She reached for her cell phone and did her best to ignore the deep dread rolling through her stomach. Molly answered, thank God. What's up? I want to keep it. Keep what? The Golden Spike, all of it, the saloon, the hotel, the cafe. I thought you wanted to sell it. I thought so too, but now I want to keep it. There was a silence on the end of the line. I don't know, Adele. I was counting on that money. You're practically itinerant.
So,
You don't have bills.
I have some debt.
Adele knew how close Molly lived to the bone, but she also knew how hard she had worked to stay debt-free. How much? I don't I can't talk about this right now. I need the money, Adele, and you already made it sound like a nightmare there. Adele moved outside and sat. It's not a nightmare at this exact moment. I'm sitting on the porch swing in front of room 1. Remember when Uncle Hugh and Daddy hung it? Molly snorted. Mama kept telling them they were hanging it crooked, and they wouldn't listen, so Mama made Daddy sleep on it that night. He was fixing it by dawn. I miss you. Then come, help me. I thought you said there were no rooms except the one you stole from Hottie McHotterson. There aren't, not yet, but with your help, there could be. Adele could almost see Molly's worried look. You could have the cafe, fix it up. We could do it together. Have you even been inside it? Adele had been too scared of what she might find to ask Nate for the key. Not yet, but it can't be that bad. An old, crappy restaurant, closed for years. Think about the size of the rats living inside there now. Adele pushed with her legs, making the old swing creak. Mama never proved that was a rat she saw. Oh, come on. She knew a rat when she saw one. Come home. Molly laughed again. Home? What are you smoking over there? Have you gone full California on me now? Remember how Uncle Hugh always said it? Molly ignored her words tumbling down the line more quickly. Just because the locals light up doesn't mean that stuff is safe for a country girl like you. Fly home. Stop. I just realized it last night that this was home. Nate, the bartender, yes? There's a way more interesting subject. The handsome Nate helped you realize this? Did he do that naked? Adele choked but managed to say, no. Liar. I can hear it in your voice. You got super sexy cuddles from him. Stop it. Fast cuddles. Molly, you did. You go, girl. How long has it been for you, anyway? Indignant, Adele said, you're forgetting Mitch. No, I'm not. You said sleeping with him was like taking a nice warm bath. I like baths. No one likes baths that much unless you're putting your coochie right under the stream of water, in which case it turns from relaxing into, Molly, I'm just saying, you needed to get some of the good stuff. Was it good? Adele folded her lips. She was not going to say this. She could barely even think of the night before without her lower parts tightening, clenching. Ah, it was. Good girl. Is this the same guy who wanted to buy the spike, though? Yeah. Have you mentioned this harebrained scheme to him? Adele stayed quiet, the swing moving gently under her. The ocean's foggy breeze caressed her cheek, and for a second, she could feel Nate's touch on her skin. Ah, you did, and it didn't go well. If you're just gonna guess everything, why do I bother calling you? I have been taking fortune-telling lessons from the ship's palm reader. I could read yours if you want. You could just send me a picture of it. I'm not quite sure if... Fly home. Stop saying that. Adele hated the way tears thickened her throat. Please come home. It's not my home. Molly's words were sharp. It was a place to go in the summer. You know why we went there? Because it was where Daddy was from. Because we never had enough money to stay wherever we spent the school year. Adele knew that. Did Molly think she didn't know that? Whatever. No darling has ever been good with money. Adele wasn't bad at it, actually. Are you really in debt? There was a fumbling sound on the other end of the line. Look, you know Lana will never agree. Can you just sell to him? It's got to be worth some cash, right? But I think this could be good for us. You can't fix us. The pain was sharp and swift. The blade sunk deep just under her ribs. Yes, I can. We can fix it. It's too broken. No, that couldn't be true. Adele had never accepted it. The fight that broke up the sisters had been a nuclear blast of heat, an impetuous bout of screaming brought on by their father's death and their grief. That was all. Didn't her sisters know that? It was time to fix it. All of it. There was a long pause. Adele heard a clicking on the line. It made Molly feel even farther away. Look, Molly interrupted her.
We're not the Darling Songbirds. We never will be, not again. But if we came together, I've forgiven you. Mostly. But Lana hasn't. You know that. The blade twisted. In a moment, it would pierce Adele's lungs. Oh, good. I'm glad you've forgiven me for just doing my best. You pushed us on the stage that night. You know you shouldn't have done that. Molly made a strangled sound. No, I am not gonna rehash this with you again. I'm done with it. We had to. You thought we had to feel the same way you did. You couldn't see that we were different people from you. Doing that show was the way to bring us back together, to be us again. You couldn't fix us, Adele. No matter how much you wanted to. You still don't know why we're still hurting, do you? I'm sorry. Do you know why? What? You say you're sorry, but I think you're sorry we couldn't make the tour. That's not what I mean. But I thought if we could just do that one show. I was too sad to sing. Lana could barely stand up. That was the pills, not her legs. There was another pause, followed by a click. An astonishing, empty, heartbreaking click as the line went dead. Molly? But her sister had hung up on her. Shit, she whispered. There was a loud creaking above her. Adele craned her head to look. The noise was coming from where the swing's chain bolted into the beam above. The swing dropped an inch. She gasped and started to stand, but then the whole damn thing crashed to the deck, first on the left side, then the bolts on the right side ripped from the beam, too. Adele was thrown off the porch and down the two shallow steps. She landed on her right elbow and her left knee, her shoulder knocking into the yellow April moon rose. Her mother's rose. She was stabbed by at least 3 thorns, and she felt the blood start sharp and hot. She would not cry. Adele stood slowly, shaking out her limbs. Nothing was broken. She was bruised badly, but she would live. And she would not cry. Instead, she held her breath until she saw black spots dance in front of her eyes like whole notes. When she was a child, she'd had fever dreams that she had broken the whole house. She didn't know how she'd done it, but she'd known she was to blame, and even her mother's cool hands on her forehead hadn't helped. She knew it was just a porch swing, just some wood and chain and bolts. But honestly, it felt like she'd just brought the whole golden spike crashing down around her ears. Chapter 29. Nate held the plastic bag tight in his hands and knocked on the door of Dixie's motorhome. It was early, and a seagull squawked sleepily overhead. Go away. I'm not going anywhere until you open this door. I'm fine. She wasn't fine. The message that Dixie had left on his cell phone asking if she could have the night off had not sounded okay. She'd been crying, or not far from it, and she was pretty damn tough. Open the door, or you're fired, he yelled. And I'll tell Phil to shut off your electricity. He owes me one. Of course, Nate would do neither. He liked the fact that Dixie was parking her motorhome in Phil Martino's mobile home park next to the marina. Phil was nosy enough to keep the whole place, full of elderly snowbirds mostly, safe and sound. The flimsy door of the wheeled house slammed open. He only saw half Dixie's arm and then heard a floof as she jumped back onto the sofa. She'd already pulled a blanket over her head by the time he entered. What's wrong? Nothing. You have to go open the bar. A few minutes late won't hurt anybody. Let Adele open it. Let her just try. Anger twisted his stomach. I'm just gonna die under here, alone. Go away. You can have my guitar, but it's a piece of junk, worse than your Martin. Send my ukulele to my sister in Arkansas. It's not half bad. Look, lady, I have a pint of chocolate peanut butter ice cream, a brand new unread People magazine, and a bag of barbecue chips. Chips? Wild brown curls and one eyeball showed. Gimme. Tell me what's going on. I lost a cat. You had a cat? Didn't you say you were allergic? Mildly. I was just helping out a friend, pet sitting for a couple of days. But it ran under the sink and hid, and then I forgot it was here. I opened the door to go for a walk this morning, and it shot out like it was chasing a mouse made of tuna. Took a right and went up the hillside, and I haven't been able to find it. So you're hiding instead of looking? Nate yanked open the bag and passed it over. Then he put the ice cream in Dixie's mini freezer.
The cat won't come to me. There's no chance. It has no idea who I am. What am I supposed to do? Go yell at an animal that's nothing but scared and lost?
Whose cat did you say it was again?
Dixie's face dissolved into tears.
Ah, said Nate. What's her name?
Georgia.
And where is she now?
In Hawaii for a week. Dixie cried harder. She loves that stupid cat.
Color?
Dixie frowned and hiccuped. What? Why would that matter?
Not Georgia the cat.
Oh, black, small, young.
Of course, that wouldn't make finding it easy. But if he could get Mrs. Souther's damn cockapoo back every time he ran off, he could do this. Name?
Taco sauce.
Nate shook his head. No, just nope. I'm not calling for a cat named after a condiment.
She found it crying next to a taqueria's trash can.
Oh my God. Fine. Give me some canned cat food. It took Nate forever to find the damn thing. He was pretty sure when he got back to the spike, Norma would be blacked out on the floor, the till empty, ravaged by some opportunist passerby. But he kept searching. Taco sauce, where are you? Come here, taco sauce. On the other side of the marina, he could hear Dixie calling too, but she sounded feeble, as if she'd already given up. Taco sauce, come on, a little spicy. He ignored the fisherman's laughter, giving Terry Dunlap a sturdy middle finger before he scrambled into the crawl space under the marina office. 3 hours later, Nate came back to Dixie's motorhome. He was sweating and covered with sticker burrs. 2 slashes ran down his left arm. Dixie sat on the tiny sofa, a spoon dug deeply into the ice cream. You got her! He released his grip on the squirming, furious little animal, and it sprinted back under the sink. Do we even know it's a her? No, I take that back. With the amount of trouble she is, she's definitely female.
Dixie launched herself at him, kissing Nate on the forehead with a smack. Look at your poor arm. Now it matches your other one. Was that the cat?
You mean Satan? Yes.
Want bandages?
He looked at his other cut, the one he'd gotten from the dishwasher.
The cut Adele had patched up when they'd kissed for the first time in the rose garden.
The wound was almost healed now, even though it felt like a lifetime ago, instead of just 4 days.
He'd gotten that cut before he'd felt Adele's slick against him, before he'd been inside her, before she'd decided to destroy his dream.
Nah, I heal fast. I'll just wash it.
Whatever you say.
Dixie took a huge bite of ice cream and then spoke around it.
Now I can work tonight, by the way. We should take the night off.
She winked.
Like you did last night.
He was not going to go into the night before. So, this Georgia, is she good enough for you?
Dixie sighed and rubbed his arm a little too hard with the washcloth. No.
But you're falling in love anyway.
You know what I always say, there's no fun in falling unless you're falling off a cliff.
Nate took a wild guess. She's in Hawaii with her girlfriend.
Dixie's eyes welled again. She told me she was gonna leave her.
You know, the women you date aren't that much different than men. Why don't you just date one of us instead?
Because I find your type boring and obsessed with sex. Speaking of which, how is the Songbird?
He wasn't going to let her twist the conversation, though. Seriously, Dixie, you're too good for her. And just like you were too good for Elaine and Derry before that. Why do you let them treat you like the hired help?
Hey, Dixie was obviously struggling to appear nonchalant. The hired help get tips, just like at the bar.
What's your tip going to be for watching her cat?
Dixie looked down at the washcloth. She was going to spend the whole night.
You mean she was going to make up some excuse so that she could get away from her partner and spend a stolen night with you?
Stolen nights are like stolen cars. They're called hot for a reason.
You're worth more than a night or two, sugar. He tapped the end of her nose. There's a reason Hugh was half in love with you. There's a reason I am.
It's the ginormous size of my rack. I know. I hear it all the time.
It doesn't hurt.
But Adele's breasts flashed into his mind. The perfect size of them, the way they felt in his hand, the way her nipples had butted under his breath. Okay, spill.
What?
He grabbed a spoon out of the small drawer next to the sink. The taco sauce hissed at him.
Give me some of that.
Dixie yanked the ice cream out of his reach. You don't get to try to fix my love life without at least returning the favor.
I have no love life to fix. He ignored her fake surprised look. I know you don't believe me, but it's true. He had anger, confusion, a terminal case of lust that had only gotten stronger having had Adele in his arms, but no love life to speak of.
You didn't come back last night. Do I need to point that out? I am the one who closed the saloon. I am the one who walked Max Fitzgibbon home when he couldn't find his car keys because I'd hidden them 2 hours before. And by the way, you owe me for that because he tried to grab my boob. Don't worry, I dodged. And when he was passed out in his comfy chair, I wrote, "Don't grab boobs," in Sharpie on his forehead.
Damn,
Nate said admiringly.
really?
Yep.
That's a good one.
I'm hoping it will sink in through his skin and maybe he'll remember it next time.
I'll tell him he's not welcome anymore.
Dixie rinsed the cloth and washed her hands. Are you serious? If you had to toss out all the problems, your saloon would be even emptier than it is. I'd be out of a job.
Speaking of that,
Uh-oh.
I can't guess what's going to happen, but, well, I'm going to be real honest here. If you get another job offer, you might want to think about taking it.
Shit. Seriously, what happened last night with her?
I don't know. A lot.
That was true. He'd been hit by a truck. That's what had happened.
But whatever it was, it convinced her that she should stay.
Stay? As in stay? Like not sell the golden spike to you?
That's what it sounds like.
Seriously? What about you? Hugh promised the place to you.
He always said I could have it if they didn't come back. Hugh's dead. She and her sisters are very much alive, and this one is back.
She just doesn't know what she needs. Nate grabbed and got the ice cream away from Dixie.
Sure, I'll let her know. Every woman loves to hear that, right?
This is just one of those times, my friend.
What kind of time?
When you have to save her from herself. Dixie took the pint back, took a spoonful, and held it out towards the cat who was slinking out from under the sink.
I have a feeling she doesn't need saving. Just like that cat doesn't need chocolate ice cream.
Of course she does. Adele, I mean, look at her. She showed up from nowhere, left her home of how many years to come sell a property? God, now that I think about it, of course it makes sense. She's running from something. It would have been a whole hell of a lot easier to hire a company, one of those property management thingies. They could have sold it for her. She didn't need to come all the way out here. There's a reason she came out here herself. She's looking to be saved. Dixie sat up excitedly, and the spoonful of ice cream plopped to the tiles.
Waste of chocolate peanut butter there.
She just doesn't know it. This is just a people problem. You're so good at taking care of people. Take care of her. Find out what she needs by keeping the golden spike and figure out how she can get that some other way. That's all. Nate twisted his hands into fists, pressing the knuckles into the tops of his thighs until it hurt.
I don't know.
Unless you don't want her to leave. He shot her a bouncer's scowl.
Don't be stupid.
Many things that are maybe less than ideal, but stupid ain't one of them. You know you won't get her to leave unless you figure out where she's supposed to be going, right?
Yeah.
He hadn't known that until just then, but damned if he'd admit it to Dixie.
I just don't think I'm the one to do it.
You're the one who deserves the golden spike. You. Not Adele, as nice as I think she is. Dixie held up the recently truant cat that now had ice cream all over its face. She waved the cat's legs at him. Taco sauce agrees. Nate could hear it purring from where he sat.
Damn.
You can do it.
Do me a favor.
Dixie smiled. I owe you so big. Name it.
If Adele calls you today, don't answer.
She blinked. Okay.
It's just that
I don't need to know, boss. I won't answer. Now, pet the cat. It's good for you. Chapter 30. After she pushed the porch swing against the wall and picked up the fallen bolts, Adele stood on her tiptoes and examined the wood above. She didn't know much about wood or construction, but the beams looked like they were made of corrugated cardboard. What did dry rot look like, exactly? Tension pulled her nerves taut. Thinking about her sister made her nauseated. Thinking about Nate made her want to come right out of her skin, her sensitive skin, the skin he'd licked and touched and slid against.
God. Adele looked at her cell phone. Only 9 in the morning. It was early enough that Nate shouldn't be at the bar yet. She didn't know where he was. He wasn't with her. He'd left. He'd left furious. But this, staying, keeping the golden spike, was the right thing to do. Something iron-like had settled into the base of Adele's spine, and for the first time in a long time, she knew that there was something she wanted to do that was bigger than just writing and rewriting songs. Songs were important, and Lord knew sometimes they were life itself, but even Adele could admit they were ephemeral. At the end of her life, she'd have a pile of invisible words set to music. Nothing she could touch, no building, no home, she whispered. This collection of buildings, though, was home. It was tangible, built by her kin, her blood. This was home. Adele hadn't been in Hugh's office for 11 years, but as soon as she unlocked the door, she felt it again. This was where she belonged. How had she and her sisters just assumed Nashville was their home instead of this place? This room had been Uncle Hugh's sanctuary, a place he loved even more than his upstairs lodging. A tacked-on addition on the south side of the saloon, it had been built by hand by Adele's father and Hugh one summer. Adele had been young, not more than 5, but she'd remembered that year as one of her father's happiest. Molly and Lana had been tiny, 3 and 2 years old. Adele remembered how her father had swung her up into his arms, getting her out of her mother's hair by taking her with him to play in the sawdust all day. One of the photos on Hugh's wall showed Adele in a pink sundress and yellow shoes, holding a hammer that was almost as big as she had been. That had been her favorite accessory that summer. Her mother had even put a loop on her dresses, and every morning Adele had dropped the hammer through it. She'd been bad at hammering actual nails, always bending them, but she'd been very good at hammering everything else: the ground, boards, the side of the building. Uncle Hugh had called her his best little helper, and she remembered the feeling of her father's hand resting heavily on top of her head in the warm sunshine. The office smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, a musty mix of something that felt like happiness. Adele turned slowly, taking in the room. Uncle Hugh had outfitted the small room simply, with a rough-hewn heavy desk and a matching chair that spun. An old wooden filing cabinet stood in the corner. The walls were hard to see under the dozens of calendar pages tacked to them. Charlie's Feed and Seed had always printed the best Darling Bay calendar every year. They were beach scenes and product placement combined: harrows on the sand, tractors on the dunes. Hugh had been sentimental about the photos and never wanted to get rid of the last year's pages, so he started tacking them up in 1989, and now they were as much a part of the decor as the dust motes dancing in the sun streaming through the window. Adele peeked through the glass. Nate's truck still wasn't in the lot, and he probably wouldn't get there until just before opening at 11, if he showed at all, that was. He'd been so angry. He would get over it, though, right? It was a huge blow she'd dealt him, she knew that. But they could work it out. Surely they could, like adults. Adele sat at the desk, feeling the comforting curve of the wooden seat under her. How many times had she spun in this chair while Uncle Hugh pretended to be grumpy about it? Even though she hadn't seen Nate since he'd left her room in such a furious hurry that morning, his presence was palpable here. A set of steel strings was on the desktop, new in its package. A couple of spy thrillers were next to the lamp, and she knew Hugh hadn't read the genre, preferring westerns and the occasional romance novel. Inside the desk's biggest drawer was the ledger she'd come in looking for. And there, on the first page, was Uncle Hugh's handwriting. She would have recognized it anywhere, dark and sharply slanted to the left, the particular way he made his 4 with 3 adjoined legs. The sight of it brought a tightness to her throat she hadn't expected, and she flipped the pages forward, impatient with herself and with Uncle Hugh for never moving to a damn computer system. And there, in the last half of the book, about 8 months back, the handwriting changed. Straight up and down numbering in a clean hand. Nate's writing. He'd obviously taken over this part of the running of the Golden Spike a while ago. Why hadn't he mentioned that when she'd asked him for the office key? Had Hugh gotten too tired to do it? Had he really been that close to selling to Nate? Adele shook her head, as if she could shake out the emotion that was making her thoughts feel heavy and sluggish. She got out the old plug-in calculator from the bottom drawer and pulled out the stack of bank statements that was in the drawer above it. Time to get down to business.
Adele didn't have entrepreneurial experience except with her own career, but she'd made that work. She filed her own quarterly taxes and knew how to maximize her deductions. A business like this would naturally have, she opened the first envelope with the most recent date, quite a bit more money than her own slim business account. She reread the amount on the bank statement. This wasn't right. There had to be another account. The bank balance in front of her was barely larger than her own personal checking account. She rummaged through the rest of the desk, opening everything she could before she realized that no, this was it. This was all she had to work with, this and her own cash. No wonder Nate hadn't been able to make any improvements on the property. The Spike had no capital, just the buildings themselves. It explained the recalcitrant dishwasher and the groaning coffee machine, the cracked skylight, the paint jobs sorely needed, the shuttered cafe, and the defunct hotel. This could be the biggest gamble she'd ever made. She had no idea what she was doing, and the chance of failure was high. How the hell would she get everything done with no money and no experience? Would Nate stay on to help her? Could she afford him? Did she want to? She heard Uncle Hugh's voice in her head. One day at a time. It wasn't until she was in her early 20s that she realized this was an AA slogan, and he'd probably picked it up from the people in his saloon who had slipped off wagons a time or two. But it helped. One piece of this puzzle at a time. Fix the saloon, hard but doable. Get her sisters back. Tuck all the songbirds in the nest. Impossible, perhaps, but she'd try anyway. Keep Nate from... No, keep herself from... God, she didn't even know how the sentence in her mind should end. She couldn't even form the thought, let alone rate how difficult it might be. She picked up the ledger again. By 11, Adele had touched every piece of paper in the office, and not one of them had made her feel better. The only good news, the only tiny scrap of it, was that there were no liens on the property. At least Uncle Hugh had been too proud to borrow money to fix it up. Or would that have been so bad? A loan on either the cafe or the hotel would have allowed food to be sold and rooms to be rented. Hard cash coming in was what was missing. The markup on alcohol was good, but the only nights the money really flowed were Fridays and Saturdays, and even then it seemed to run as reluctantly as a California creek in August. Adele's phone chimed. She blew her hair out of her eyes, wishing for a hair tie. It was hot and airless in the office, something she hadn't remembered. FYI, it's my day off. Adele's face heated. There weren't enough words on the screen to be able to read into them, but she could give it a try. Was this about last night? She rubbed her eyes with the palms of her hand. She was sweating at her hairline. She'd need to buy a fan or put in another window. The fan was a lot more affordable. She tapped back. Of course. Would Dixie come in then? Is that how they worked their schedule since Hugh died? Why hadn't she thought to ask Nate about what they did concretely on a day-to-day basis? As if he could hear her thoughts, another text came in. Dixie sent me a text. She's sick today. It was a plan, one they'd set up together. They wanted her to panic. Of course they did. So, even though her heart was racing and sweat was wetting her shirt, she wrote back, Not a problem. See you tomorrow. No response. She took a moment to imagine him. Was he on his boat? She wanted to see it. How big was his bed? A twin? He was so tall. How would he fit in something so small? Did boats have beds bigger than that, though? Was he lying there looking at his phone, satisfied with plaguing her? Or was he feeling the same way she was, shaken to the core? Scared? Did his skin ache like hers did? She felt as if she were running a fever. The only thing that could cool her was more of him, more of his touch, and more of his laugh, which was the most distressing part of all. Sex was just a thing. Two bodies rubbing together, making heat. But the laughter they'd shared while in bed together was like nothing she'd ever known. The connection. Sparks from their touch reflected in their eyes. He'd seen her, the whole package of faults and worries and silliness and excitement. And she'd seen him. The way when he was loving her, there was nothing else for him in the whole world. The difficulty he'd had in letting himself go, letting himself feel pleasure. The way when he'd given himself over, he'd looked like he could reach up and touch the moon. Whatever that thing was between them, it had been intoxicating and immediately addictive. She needed more. Could he possibly know how quiet her brain had gone in those 2 hours she'd lain in his arms like she'd been meant to be there all her life? What if his not coming in today was about that, and not the fact that she was going to keep the bar? A low ache tugged at the back of her neck, a headache threatening like a storm. She rummaged in the desk drawers until she found a rubber band. She pulled back her hair so tightly her facial skin felt taut. Moving forward. This was business. That was all it was. She could run a damn bar for one damn day. How hard could it possibly be?